Hi everyone, welcome to this month's security session. This month we're going to be talking about a feature of Azure Active Directory called Conditional Access, and some people call it an identity firewall. So I've done a couple of these. I'm Tom Wild. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. I work with partners and help build security practices and solutions. John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi all, I'm Jonathan Worsfold. I'm a cloud solution architect in the same team as Tom, predominantly focusing on identity and security.
Cool, thanks John. So you're going to walk us through conditional access and explain how it's a bit of an identity firewall these days?
That's right, yeah. But before we get into conditional access, it's probably worth understanding why identity is important. So our research has shown that at the moment, 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft. So it's not so much about people trying to breach firewalls and hacking, and it's actually people being able to get hold of credentials. And there's a number of ways that can happen. People typically use the same email address and password to sign up to other services. So though your corporate credentials you might deem safe and secure, if somebody goes and signs up to a third-party cloud service and uses their email address for work, and because they can't remember a different password, use the same password, in effect, those credentials are now compromised.
Yeah, having just a single username and password to gain access to something is not a good solution these days, is it?
And 73% of people do it, and I'll put my hand up, I've done it as well, because there's so many different services out there, you can't remember all those different passwords. So it's just natural habit to go, well, I need to remember what the password is, so I'll just pick the same password that I use for that other service. And shadow IT is growing at quite a significant rate. And that's because people are used to cloud services at home as well as at work. So people are used to using things like Dropbox and other cloud services. So they're more familiar with using those and often use them as a way to access something. I was speaking to somebody the other day, and they use Dropbox. It's not corporate approved, but in their scenario, they like to read their sales figures on their iPad in bed the night before a meeting, rather than sit on their laptop.
Yeah.
So they copy the file into Dropbox so they can open it on their iPad. They don't deem that as being, bad practice, but because of that, they're now using a non-approved application and accessing corporate data, and those credentials are being passed around, and we're seeing more and more cases of that.
So they're using their own personal Dropbox subscription rather than a business one, and that's shadow IT, the IT that the IT department don't know about effectively.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we set our mind back not that many years, before we all started moving to the cloud, as IT guys and girls, our way of protecting was firewalls and networking.
Yeah.
We could build a big wall around our users, our devices, our servers, applications and data. And we would just allow certain traffic and ports in and out that we deemed necessary. So, and even from a physical point of view, probably our server room was in our main office, or we might have a colo or a separate data center, but it was a physical building with racks, probably with locks on the racks, and we held the keys. So we had that protection.
Yeah, you'd have a few VPNs and things like that, but that's essentially what IT was, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. But that's changed over the last few years. Businesses are now consuming more and more cloud apps and SaaS services. Everybody now is moving towards this because it's a natural progression. If you need, let's say Salesforce, for example, if you need Salesforce, why would you want to nowadays buy a load of servers, put lots of software on, make it resilient, maybe split it across data centers to run Salesforce, when you can go and subscribe for X number of pounds per user per month and access the service? Because actually that's what you want. You want to provide that service. You don't need to provide all that infrastructure. Now, it used to be necessary, but now we're moving to a cloud world. You can consume these services as opposed to having to build them.
Yeah.
Now, those services are obviously out on the cloud, so there is no firewall per se around them that you're in control of. They're just out available on the public internet.
Yeah, cloud services are the ones that worry about the infrastructure these days, right?
That's right.
Not us.
And users now are consuming services, both corporate and personal, on a number of devices. So everybody has a corporate laptop or desktop machine, and probably have a corporate phone. But so many businesses are either using bring your own device, or users are just doing it themselves because they've got a better phone, or a phone they prefer that's to the company issue. They might have personal devices, going back to that scenario with an iPad.
Yeah.
They might want to use their personal iPad because they just want to consume the data in a different way, a more comfortable way in that scenario. And even devices like the Amazon Alexa, you can actually consume some of these services through devices like that, or even an Apple Watch. So we're now moving to a scenario where we've got users that are roaming. They're not necessarily in a office location that you're aware of.
Some of them are guests as well, from contractors or other organisations as well.
That's right. They're consuming lots of different services that aren't on premise anymore. They're out in the cloud, such as Office 365, Salesforce, Box, and they're using any number of different devices. So what we end up with is this really complicated matrix of possible scenarios that a given user will consume a data or service from a type of device.
Yeah.
And as the slide tries to imply, it's complicated because there's so many different scenarios. It's not just here's a laptop in a building accessing a server.
Lots of different identities on there as well. I can see Facebook, Google, Ping. These are different identity providers that allow you to log into things, which adds more complexity, right?
That's right, yeah. So the Microsoft solution is based around Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is, in most cases in an enterprise organization, a replica of your on-premise Active Directory. So we have a product called AAD Connect, which you install on-premise, and that synchronizes your identities into an Azure Active Directory. From there, you can then associate or link services, so Office 365, Salesforce, etc., to that Azure Active Directory. So you end up with identity being your new control plane. So using an identity, you can now distinguish what they can and can't do with your on-premise stuff and services in the cloud.
Okay, so connect everything up to Azure Active Directory effectively, and then you've got control over it. You've got, access as to who can do what, from what device, where, those sorts of things.
That's right. And it's probably worth just mentioning that we say synchronize the identity, and it is a synchronized copy. However, there's a number of options you have. So you can synchronize a hash of the password and have what we call a cloud identity, or you can federate the identity, which means the authentication goes back to the on-premise domain controllers and uses ADFS to do that single sign-on.
Oh, okay.
So either scenario, the users are using the same username and password. It's just where the authentication happens. So though technically it is a synchronized identity from a user perspective, and even for most parts an admin perspective, it is one identity.
Cool. So, one secure single identity, no multiple passwords or usernames for a user to remember, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
And if you reset a password on a user, that replicates and synchronizes. Yeah. So, from a user perspective, it is a single identity.
Cool.
Which not only consumes Microsoft services and on-premise services, but all these external third-party services like Salesforce.
Yeah, I can see Workday and ServiceNow and things like that on there as well.
That's right.
Non-Microsoft apps connect to Azure Active Directory as well, and then you can authenticate to them.
Correct, yeah. And it simplifies that provisioning process. And though we won't cover it today, you can also do group-based licensing assignment. So when a user is in a certain group, you can actually give them a license to something like Workday automatically.
Oh, okay, and it does that provisioning for the joiners, movers, leavers process as well.
Correct,
okay,
yeah.
Awesome.
So now we've got identity as our central pin.
Yeah.
We can then look at conditional access to look at the different scenarios and build out. But before we do that, it's probably just worth mentioning about the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. So this is our unique selling point with our security platform and Azure Active Directory. And basically what the Intelligent Security Graph is circa about 10 terabytes of data per day from a variety of sources. So you'll see on there that we get 400 billion emails analysed. We've got 930 million threats detected on devices. We take all the telemetry from all our different services and bring it together to build what we call the security graph. And based on that, we know what good looks like and we know what bad looks like. So if we detect a known piece of malware and we've seen it in action, we know what patterns it does. You know, whether it starts trying to spool up PowerShell scripts on different machines, we know what that looks like. So we can then pull that data in to understand and evaluate risk within the organization and within that process.
Okay.
So it covers a wide range of services, but for today, what we're going to be talking about is user login, user risk and login risk.
Okay.
So the Intelligent Security Graph, in terms of user risk, is going out and purchasing stolen credentials on the black market, the dark web, for example. And what we're looking for is what identities are on the market and how they possibly relate to an Azure Active Directory account.
Okay, kind of like haveibeenpwned.com.
Yes, yeah, very similar to that. So going back to that scenario where, you know, I use Office 365, but I've actually signed up to Yahoo Mail, and I've actually used my corporate username and password because I've used my email address for work because I needed to provide one. Couldn't remember a different password, so I've used the same password there. If in that scenario that organization has its credentials stolen, Azure Active Directory and the Intelligent Security Graph will make a relationship on those credentials to that Azure AD account and go, there's a risk there. It's not to say it has been compromised, but because the email addresses match, there is a risk there.
Okay.
So we measure that, and there's various different grades of risk, and that's to do with your appetite. With login risk, what we're looking there is based on what we know is and isn't possible. So the most common scenario is impossible travel. So if you're logging in from France, then 5 minutes later you're logging in from the States, and then a minute later you're trying to log in from China, that's impossible travel. So we can then use our graph to tell you that, you know what, this sign-in is risky because you can't do that travel. So most likely something's been compromised somewhere.
Okay, so it gives you this intelligence gives you a low, medium, high score, and you can decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
Basically. Okay.
So when we look at conditional access, we'll sort of walk through the scenario of that. So with conditional access, we can create rules to protect our services at the front door. So we have a set of conditions, and we can set based on users, and that's our starting point, and should always be the starting point because that's our single control plane. What device they're using, where they're accessing from, and what they're actually trying to access. Based on those conditions, we can then look using the Intelligent Security Graph, and you can see the data being fed in there, what that session risk is. So we could say, for example, if your credentials, Tom, are matching some or very similar to some that are available on the black market, we could say, you know what, there is a risk. There's a medium to high risk that your credentials are going to be compromised because we can see your email address available on the market. Based on that risk, we could then say, well, you know what, if you're inside the network, we'll still let you access services, but we'll make you do a forced password reset.
Okay.
If you're outside the network in terms of location, we'll deny access.
Okay, so you can define the trusted locations and do different rules based on those locations.
That's right, yeah. And any possible scenario is able to be counted for. So when we had that complicated mesh of users, devices, services, this is where you can actually define what you do and don't want to allow.
So this is kind of what people are calling an identity firewall rule.
That's right, yeah.
Because it's all connected to Azure Active Directory, therefore you can do kind of like a firewall rule, but based on users, devices, and so on.
That's right. And you can also use this for on-premise applications as well. So it isn't just a cloud service.
With application proxy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Using Azure AD proxy, you can publish your internal apps.
Cool. All right.
So, should we run through a demo?
Yeah, let's see it. So what have we got here?
So this is the Azure portal. So this is just a Azure Active Directory. And within Azure Active Directory, we have conditional access down in security. So in here, this is where we'll define our policies. Now, the first thing that's probably worth talking about is named locations. So if you're doing any location-based rules, this is where you can define your IP ranges. So in here, you can go in and you can define your on-premise networks and put all the IP address subnets in.
Yeah. So trusted subnets, trusted public IPs, those sorts of things.
Correct.
Okay.
And then you can use that in the rules base. So we've already got one in here. Have a look. What we should see is some IP ranges.
Okay.
So when we set rules up, if the user is coming from that IP range, we can allow or disallow something to happen.
Yeah, okay, good.
The other thing that's worth notifying you about is the terms of use. So in here, you can upload your terms and conditions that the users have to accept. So you can have a process where if they're accessing an application outside of the network on maybe a non-corporate device, they have to accept some terms and conditions that the business has set out that they won't, abuse the system. They won't, send data on or save it locally. You can define whatever you want there and
cool. And I can see that's audited and things like that as well. So you can prove who's done what and when and things like
who's
that.
accepted, who's declined,
who's read every single line of the terms and conditions, right?
That's probably going to be few, but so let's go through and create a policy. So I think you've got some scenarios you want to walk through, Tom.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about, let's use Azure Information Protection. So we've done a security session on this in the past where people want document protection, particularly around GDPR and things like that. It's becoming more prevalent. But can we create a conditional access rule for all users that if they're accessing a protected document, so a confidential or highly confidential document, outside the network, they need to verify their identity with MFA or something like that. Can we do that?
Yeah, sure. So if we click New Policy, you'll see that once we've given it a name, so we'll call this one Protected Documents.
Okay.
We have users and groups where we can assign what users, then the application, define the conditions, and then we can set the access controls. So in here, we can select from Azure Active Directory all users, or we could specify particular users or groups of users. And what you'll see is there'll be a GAL. So as you type, you can start selecting somebody. So is there a particular group you want to do this for?
Let's do all users.
Okay.
All of the users within this organisation access AIP documents at some point or another.
Brilliant. It's also worth mentioning that most of the definitions also have an exclude.
Okay.
So you don't need to create two rules for this.
Yeah.
If you were I want this to be finance and nobody else, you don't have to create one rule that says finance can and one rule that says all other users can't.
Okay.
You can just use the exclude.
All right, good. Cool. And then I'm guessing the cloud app would be Azure Information Protection.
Spot on. So here you can define your apps. you can select all cloud apps. And the reason I'm calling this out, and it even tells you when you select it, is be very wary of doing that, because if you turn something on like block access for all users from cloud apps that aren't in a certain location, you could actually lock yourself out of the Azure and Office 365 admin portals as well.
Don't do that.
No, so just be wary of doing that.
I'm guessing that warning's there because people have done it in the past.
Yeah. So if we go into the apps, here we'll see a long list of applications that we can select, both Microsoft and non-Microsoft. So you'll see boxes listed there as well. And actually, we don't have to search. The Azure Information Protection one is already there. So we simply select that. And you can select more than one, so you don't have to create a rule per application.
Okay.
So if we were to come along later and have a very similar scenario, but just for another application, we could simply add it to this rule. You wouldn't have to create a new rule. And then we get to the conditions. So we've defined our users and we've defined what they're accessing. So at this point, we now define the scenario. So here we've got the sign-in risk, which is what we talked about earlier.
Oh, that's the intelligent security graph.
That's right,
okay.
Yeah. We've then got device platforms where we can define what type of devices we have. We have locations, which we're going to need for your rule, which we'll come back to. We can then, in preview, define whether it's a browser or a mobile stroke rich application.
Okay.
And device state, where we can determine whether it's a corporate machine or not. So either an MDM managed or domain joined machine.
Okay.
But in your scenario, we have locations. So we'll configure this. And what we're going to do here is the rule you want is if they're accessing a protected document outside the network, you want them to do MFA.
Yeah, outside my trusted locations, effectively.
So here you've got two options. You've got trusted locations, which is defined in that location, or if you want it to be more granular, you can go in and define your location. So we should say there's the trusted IPs, the trusted locations, but we also have a separate one for on-prem.
Okay.
Now, depending on how geographically dispersed your networks are, you might want to limit it to certain networks.
Okay.
But what we're going to do here is slightly different. So because we want to trigger MFA accessing protected documents, what we're going to say is we're going to any location, if they're accessing from any location, excluding
excluding our trusted locations.
Yes, excluding your trusted locations.
Okay.
So we can go there, select the on-prem, select that. So what we've got is, doesn't matter where you are, except if you're in the office.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll click done there, click done here.
Okay, and then MFA effectively, I mean, how do we do that? And is that just, do you want to just let us know about kind of the MFA providers? Have we got, is it Microsoft or do we connect to others as well?
So we do connect to others.
Okay.
So for example, the likes of RSA,
you
can use those. So within Azure Active Directory, you can define who your MFA provider is. Microsoft has one, and a lot of the licensing plans for Azure Active Directory and Office 365 do include it.
Okay,
so
cool.
You do get MFA included with a lot of the plans. But yes, you can select a third party if you've already got something in use.
Okay, good.
So in here, we're going to grant access, but we're going to require multi-factor authentication.
Cool. All right. So that's pretty much it, isn't it?
That is, yeah. We'd click select. We'd turn the policy on.
Probably do it for our test users first, though, right?
Yes, yeah. Always test it with some test users to see what happens. But that rule's now in place.
Cool. All right. So I've got another one for you, John.
Okay.
This one's for Salesforce. So we've connected Salesforce up to Azure Active Directory. We've got single sign-on, automatic provisioning, and things like that. We want to do a rule for our sales team because they're the only ones that have access to Salesforce. And we want to say they can only access it if the device is compliant and so it's managed with its, let's call it Intune, and they've accepted the terms and conditions you spoke about earlier.
Okay, sure. So let's create a new policy and call this Salesforce. So again, we're going to the user and groups, and this is just for the sales team, you said?
Yeah, just for the sales team.
So we'll select users and groups. And there's the sales team.
Okay.
So we'll select that. Go into our cloud applications, and obviously we're going to select Salesforce.
You can really start to see how once you've connected everything up to Azure Active Directory, whether it's third-party MFA providers, third-party apps, it just starts to come together really, doesn't it? So the more you connect to it, the better state you're in.
That's right, and look how simple it is. When you think about, I want to use another cloud service, you'd literally just have to go through and do a lot of work traditionally to configure and get that integration, where we've just searched for it and selected it. So we then go to conditions.
Yeah, and we want a compliant device. So let's say a device that's managed by Intune, and Intune has to say it's been compliant, it's had a recent scan, those sorts of things. So I'd assume that those are configured within Intune, and then Intune has to tell Azure Active Directory it is compliant.
That's right. So there's two ways to do that. There's the new device state preview, where you can go through and define whether it's an Azure AD registered device and it's compliant in an MDM, such as Intune, but also AirWatch or other MDM providers. But before the preview, and this is still a valid way of doing it, we can actually go straight to grant access and say, require the device to be marked as compliant.
Cool. So if it hasn't had like a recent scan and Intune says it's not compliant, it hasn't had a recent scan, then it wouldn't let you through because Azure Active Directory would block it, right?
So this would query Intune in our case, but like I said, you can use other MDMs. And if the device wasn't marked as compliant, you'd get a message saying that's the case and you'd be rejected. You'll also see down here that the terms of conditions that you published are listed, and you would simply just select the correct terms and condition.
Cool. So when the user accesses that device, they'll access that app, they'll have to be compliant with Intune or other MDM, and then they'll have to click accept on the terms of use once to be able to have access.
That's right.
Okay.
One thing that's worth quickly pointing out is the multiple controls.
Yeah.
You've got the option to say, I require all of the above, or require one of them.
Right. Okay.
So you could have a scenario where you've got hybrid Azure AD joined machines, which are managed by Config Manager, not Intune, and therefore they wouldn't show as compliant. So you could actually have an either or there. So they're either a corporate machine or they're marked as compliant.
All right, good.
Again, turn the policy on, and that's it. Salesforce is now set up that it would have to be a compliant device in Intune in order to access it.
Awesome. Okay, well, final one, and this one's for the finance department. There's an on-premise application that used to be open for anonymous access. So we've connected that up with application proxy to Azure Active Directory. And we want to wrap conditional access around it, which is great because it used to be anonymous access, so not very secure there. This app's called Centrifuge, so it's called OP_Centrifuge, and we just want to block high risk, basically. So can we do that?
Yeah. So we're given a name. I'm going to use as an select
our finance team.
I'm going to the cloud apps, and because you've registered it, we're using Azure AD proxy.
Yeah.
We should see it listed in our applications.
Okay.
So you said it was called OP_.
Yeah, we've named all our on-premise applications OP. So we've got quite a few. All right.
And it was high risk you wanted to block.
Yeah. But you know what? Let's block medium as well, because what you said earlier made me nervous about credentials.
So you'd select your appetite for risk. And worth noting for when you guys are doing this yourselves, if you click on the info at the top, it'll take you to a web page with a really good matrix table of all the definitions of high, medium, low, so you can get a real granular feel for what the difference is between those.
Okay.
So we've selected medium and high. And then we would go into here and we would simply set block access.
Gotcha.
So within this rule, if you're the finance team, no matter where you are, what device you're using, if you try accessing this and the intelligent security graph deems this rule to this login to be, suspicious, or there's a chance it's been compromised, it'll block access to your on-premise application.
Cool. Okay. So from a user's perspective, what would they see and how do they access applications?
So they would access the applications using the app portal, the company app portal.
Oh, okay. They're similar to the similar one in the Office portal, isn't it?
Yeah,
okay.
Very, very similar. And these are all the applications you've published. And you define this as an admin as what is and isn't published.
Okay.
So in here we would see there's the application.
Gotcha. There's our on-premise, there's Salesforce. Okay, wicked.
And yeah, they'd click that, or they could save it to their favourites.
I don't see AIP on there, but that's obviously not a SaaS-based app. So it'd be when they open the protected document in Word or something, it would then prompt them.
Correct, that's right, yeah.
Okay.
It would look at it that way.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
No problem at all.
Cool. All right. So, yeah, thanks very much, John, to giving us a good walkthrough of conditional access. Let us know what you thought of this session. Did you find it useful? And if you go to aka.ms security session vote on what you want from the next session. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next month.